It's an undeniable reality that over the last 20 years, the economic landscape in Palestine has been deeply impacted by Israeli actions. Bombings, digging tunnels, building walls to separate areas, taking over land, restricting access to essentials like food and electricity. This makes life in Palestine similar to that in an open-air prison. Hard for anyone to imagine, these are the conditions of 21st century Palestine. Today's video explores how Palestinians live under these circumstances and what Israel's role is in creating these conditions. Palestine's position in the international community is unusual, to say the least. In 2012, the UN made Palestine an observer state, which means it can speak but can't vote. Besides Palestine, only the Holy See, also known as the Vatican, has this status. As of 2019, 138 of the 193 UN countries, including China, India, and Russia, recognize Palestine as a country. But others like the US, Germany, France, and South Korea don't. With no consensus on how to define Palestine, organizations like the World Bank and IMF refer to it as WBG, short for West Bank and Gaza, instead of Palestine. A little-known fact is that Palestine is actually divided into two separate regions, the West Bank and Gaza. Though the conditions in these two regions are very different. According to an estimation by the World Bank in 2022, the GDP per capita was $4,458 in the West Bank, while in Gaza it was $1,257. Meanwhile, Israel on the other side of the wall has a GDP per capita of almost $55,000, 12 times that of the West Bank and 43 times that of Gaza. But why is this number in neighboring Israel so vastly different, and even within Palestine itself? To understand this, let's take a quick look at the historical backdrop of Palestine. If you caught our episode on Israel's economy, you might remember some of this. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century until World War I. After the war, it fell under British mandate. Then, in 1947, the UN proposed Resolution 181. This plan recommended the division of the British Mandate of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. On May 14, 1948, just before the British Mandate over Palestine was set to end, the Jewish people declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This declaration was met with strong opposition from Arab nations, resulting in the First Arab-Israeli War. The war ended in 1949 with a ceasefire agreement, resulting in Israel controlling more territory than it initially proposed in Resolution 181. After the partition, Jordan managed the larger West Bank, and Egypt oversaw the Gaza Strip, leading to Palestine's disappearance from the map in what is known as the Era of Disappearance. Although Jordan granted citizenship to West Bank Palestinians, their strong national identity made assimilation challenging. Amidst this, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was founded in 1964 as a unique political military group. It's different from an actual government, but recognized internationally as the representative of the Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat, a name that was often mentioned in the news, was its chairman. In 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War broke out, with Israel fighting against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The war, lasting just 6 days from June 5th, ended in a quick victory for Israel, where it captured not only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also occupied the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. After returning the Sinai Peninsula, Israel focused on managing the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Israel didn't try to immediately assimilate the Palestinians because it just wasn't feasible. Instead, they enforced strict military and economic control over the land, sea, and air. However, this led to increasing conflicts. Starting in 1987, Palestinians started resisting with protests, stone throwing, strikes, and homemade Molotov cocktails. This resistance lasted several years and became known as the First Intifada. In 1988, during the second year of the Intifada, the PLO declared the State of Palestine. In that same year, a Palestinian charity, once known as the Islamic Center, transformed into the Islamic Resistance Movement, better known as Hamas. Its goal? The destruction of Israel and the creation of a unified Palestinian state. At that time, though, its impact was limited. Then, on August 20th, 1993, PLO Chairman Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, with US mediation, met in Oslo, Norway, and reached an agreement. This led to the historic signing of the Oslo Accords at the White House, where both sides recognized each other and signed treaties to reduce the conflict. However, the period of peace did not last long. 2 years after the Oslo Accords, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated. This, along with a series of terrorist attacks, led to the indefinite postponement of the Oslo Accords. And in the year 2000, the Second Intifada began. Much deadlier than the first, leading to around 5,000 Palestinian and 1,000 Israeli deaths. Increasingly frequent suicide attacks prompted Israel to implement stricter military control over Palestine, building barriers and high walls around Gaza and the West Bank. They also destroyed Gaza's airport and a port that was under construction. In 2004, the death of Yasser Arafat led to a split in Palestinian politics between the Fatah movement, the largest faction within the PLO, and the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. Known for its more radical approach, Hamas gained significant influence as the nationalistic sentiments between Palestinians and Israelis rose. In the 2006 parliamentary elections, Hamas won the majority, becoming the dominant force in Palestinian politics. This led to a conflict between Fatah and Hamas, resulting in the West Bank falling under Fatah and the Gaza Strip under Hamas control. Despite multiple attempts at negotiation, this separation has largely persisted until today. Now let's dive into the Palestinian economy. As mentioned earlier, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are both part of Palestine but completely different, so it makes sense to talk about them separately. First, let's look at the West Bank. In the West Bank, the economic situation is different from anywhere else in the world. This is largely due to something called the settlements. These are essentially communities of Jewish people that Israel established within Palestinian territories. This began after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip. They started building these communities in parts of these regions where typically no Arab people lived, and allowed Jewish people to move in. Essentially, it's a way for Israel to extend its presence into Palestinian lands. The Jewish population in the West Bank settlements was initially small, but it grew to over 100,000 by 1984. And in the late 80s, the expansion of these settlements accelerated when Israel put in more roads and infrastructure across the West Bank. Today, there are more than 250 settlements with over 700,000 Jews. And this is a big deal, especially considering the West Bank's Palestinian population is around 2.75 million. One important thing to note, the United Nations, international courts, and the global community consider these Israeli settlements illegal. However, there is limited action that can be taken. Initially, Palestinians were really angry about it, leading to more conflicts. So in response, the Oslo II Accord was signed in 1995 as an extension of the original Oslo Accords. In Oslo II, both sides basically agreed to divide the West Bank into 3 areas, A, B, and C. Area A is governed autonomously by the Palestinians, and it's where Arabs live, though it accounts for only 18% of the land. Area B is also governed by the Palestinians, but the Israeli military can exercise joint control. It makes up 22% of the land. And finally, Area C. It's the largest of them all, accounting for 60% of the land. This is the area that is fully controlled by Israel and includes all Jewish settlements. But despite Palestinian autonomy in Area A, the area is essentially divided into 165 separate enclaves, each like an isolated island. Israeli military control of the connecting roads further limits their autonomy. So, what does life look like in the West Bank? Well, you'll often see 2 roads side by side, divided by a wall. On one road, you've got cars with yellow plates, mostly driven by Jewish and foreign nationals. They can move freely within the West Bank. On the other side, there are cars with white plates for Palestinians. Here, travel feels more like constant stop and go, thanks to numerous Israeli control points. To get through, they valid reasons, like work or medical permits. Queuing at these checkpoints can take hours. So you see, even within the West Bank, the movement of Palestinians is strictly controlled by Israel. But have you ever wondered what Israeli settlements are actually like? I always believed these were all just temporary structures squished onto tiny plots. Turns out, nothing could be further from the truth. These are high-end communities built with hefty funding from the Israeli government and generous donations from international Jewish communities. There are entertainment facilities, supermarkets, universities, and industrial zones. Business is thriving too. But here's the thing, house prices and living expenses are much lower in these areas compared to the rest of Israel. No wonder over 700,000 Jews have made the move and set up their homes just across the wall from the Palestinians. Among the residents of these settlements, many have moved for historical, religious, or political reasons. believing that this land belonged to their ancestors and that they should have it back. However, according to Israeli surveys, the main reason for most is simply a better quality of life. Just take a look at these pictures. Peaceful, serene communities that seem a world away from conflict. It's hard to imagine that this is actually at the core of current world conflicts. And slowly it starts to make sense why Area C is doing so much better than Areas A and B. How can an economy flourish when it's chopped into hundreds of isolated sections, each separated by checkpoints and movement restrictions? A significant consequence of this division is that many of Palestine's essential economic resources are under Israeli control. Crucial farming areas are entirely managed by Israel, significantly impacting Palestinian agriculture. Israel also controls most of the water resources in the region, where Palestinians, who make up 80% of the West Bank's population, receive just 17% of the fresh water. That's 20 times less than in Israeli settlements. However, the biggest obstacle to economic growth of the Palestinian economy in the region is the Israeli permit system. In essence, Palestinians need to obtain permits from Israel for pretty much everything. It's like Israel is running the world's strictest school, and the Palestinians are perpetually stuck in the principal's office. Need to drive over to the next town? Permit. Want to add a room to your house or plant a tree? Permit. How about importing books, registering a birth, or even getting a phone line or a driver's license? You guessed it, permit. So you see, everything is subject to very strict Israeli restrictions. But what if you're even slightly suspect or unusual? Getting a permit can become impossible, and this restriction makes it difficult to develop industries that need a lot of collaboration between people. Agriculture remains the top industry, officially employing 13.4% of the population. But in reality, it's estimated that around 90% of Palestinians in the West Bank are involved in some form of agricultural work. An economy fundamentally thrives on exchange, the movement of resources and labor. In the West Bank, Israel's tight grip on all forms of exchange has led to a very slow economic growth that directly impacts the region's GDP per capita, which is only 1/12 of Israel's. Now let's talk governance in Area A. With all these restrictions, what does self-governance look like there? The Oslo II Accords actually granted the Palestinian government a decent amount of freedom, at least in Areas A and B. They can hold elections, have their own president, and even make their own laws. And fun fact, one such law stipulates that selling your house to an Israeli Jew is punishable by death. Yet there are significant economic limitations. For example, the Palestinian government can't issue its own currency, and instead must use the new shekel, Israel's currency. This dependence extends to taxes as well. Many taxes, particularly those involving trade with Israel, are actually collected by the Israeli government. This includes customs duties and VAT on products sold in Israel. Israel then deducts a 3% processing fee, and then transfers the remaining funds to the Palestine government. These funds transferred account for over 2/3 of the Palestinian government's total income. This is problematic, as Israel can find various reasons to delay these transfers, and they have done so frequently. And with this, the financial lifeline of the Palestinian government is effectively controlled by Israel. But what's even more troublesome is the significant amount of resources they have to dedicate to security. The West Bank has at least 50,000 security personnel whose job involves suppressing resistance within the Palestinian community itself. This has led to significant dissatisfaction among Palestinians and the Fatah government, which they see as an extension of Israeli control. So you see, the Palestinian Fatah government faces an uphill economic battle. As a result, both the Palestinian government and its people rely heavily on international aid. My research indicates that the West Bank receives about $1 to $3 billion annually in aid, primarily from the United States and the European Union. However, the discovery of widespread corruption within the Palestinian government led to a decline in international aid. That's basically the economic situation in the West Bank. However, and this will surprise you, most Palestinians living in the West Bank are not living in the dire conditions often portrayed in the news. During my research, I looked at all forms of media, including vlogs by people living in the area. And from the footage I've seen, life in the West Bank, especially in Area A, doesn't seem to be the bleak picture often painted in the media. It's underdeveloped, yes, and there are restrictions we can't ignore. However, for many Palestinians, daily life is surprisingly normal. Of course, if you've been to the area or lived there, please share in the comments what your experience was like. I even found some data that somewhat confirms the previous point. The unemployment rate in the West Bank is around 17%. That's not great, but it's still within a reasonable range for an economy. From what I found, sectors like agriculture and tourism are showing promising growth that is quite impressive. And guess what? The West Bank even has its own banks and a stock exchange with 48 stocks valued at over $3 billion. The 5 to 6 years after 2007 actually experienced a significant increase in GDP per capita. So while it's still trailing far behind Israel and struggling with various controls and blockades, the West Bank's economy is, in its own way, making progress. However, the situation in the Gaza Strip, which we are about to discuss, is completely different. The Gaza Strip is a narrow strip along the southwest side of Israel, about 40 kilometers long and 12 kilometers wide, bordering Egypt to the south. It spans only 365 square kilometers, roughly 1/15 the size of the West Bank. Yet it's home to over 2.3 million people, making it one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Over 60% of these people are Arabs who fled to Gaza from Israel due to various conflicts over the past half-century. Initially, Israel's management of Gaza was somewhat similar to the current situation in the West Bank, with settlements, permits, and military control. However, as the radical Hamas grew stronger in Gaza and violent conflicts became more frequent, the Israeli government dismantled all 21 settlements in Gaza in 2005 and withdrew all 8,500 Jewish residents. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian elections and seized control of Gaza during the civil war in 2007. Due to Hamas's radical stance to destroy Israel, the United States and the European Union completely cut off economic aid to the Hamas government after they came to power. Israel also began to impose an unprecedented blockade on the Gaza Strip by land, sea, and air. They erected high fences and intensified military patrols. While the West Bank also has fences, they're somewhat loose and have some loopholes. However, the fence around Gaza is a complete blockade, leaving only a northern checkpoint connecting to Israel and a southern one to Egypt. Only a few people with medical or special permits can leave. In fact, before 2005, there were over 100,000 Palestinians from the Gaza Strip who worked in Israel, and the economic exchange between the two sides was relatively normal. After the full blockade, the unemployment rate in the Gaza Strip skyrocketed to over 50%. Israel strictly controlled all material exchanges with Gaza, including energy, food, water, and medical equipment. Most of Gaza's electricity, controlled by Israel, relies on Israeli-provided fossil fuels. The severe shortage of electricity leads to power outages exceeding 11 hours daily in the Gaza area. Even food is strictly controlled by Israel. Originally, fishing was one of the few pillar industries in the Gaza Strip, but after the blockade, Israel only allowed Gazans to fish within a range of 3 to 6 nautical miles. And it's worth noting that the Oslo Accords discussed a fishing range of 20 nautical miles. Israel even uses drones to drop harmful herbicides over some agricultural areas in the Gaza Strip to limit the growth of crops. Due to these long-term blockades, resources in the Gaza Strip are extremely scarce. In 2000, about 1.1 million people, half the population, received physical aid from the United Nations. And Gaza has been completely unable to establish a proper wastewater treatment system. 78% of the water resources are polluted, and a quarter of the diseases among the residents are caused by microbes and viruses in the water. So you see, unlike the West Bank, you can walk around freely within Gaza, and Hamas can govern autonomously. But for basic necessities like food, water, electricity, energy, and medical supplies, there is a severe shortage. This makes it impossible to develop any significant industry. You might think that with a 50% unemployment rate, at least half of the people have jobs, right? But the actual situation is far worse than this figure suggests. The definition of unemployment is the proportion of people in the working-age population who want to find work, but cannot. The high unemployment rate in Gaza means many people simply do not want to find work, so they're not included in this base figure. For example, women almost always do not seek work. So of the 2.3 million population in Gaza, only about 200,000 people are working, which is less than 1/10 of the population. And of these, 40% are actually government officials. The remaining very few, just over 100,000 people, are mostly concentrated in very basic industries like agriculture, fishing, and a very small amount of manufacturing. What's more troublesome is that scarcity of resources often breeds corruption. Similar to the Palestinian government in the West Bank, the Hamas government in Gaza is also very corrupt. Therefore, life for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is extremely difficult. Now let's take a look at the population structure of Gaza. When I first saw it, I was really shocked. Last time we discussed Israel's economy, and we saw that its population structure is basically an isosceles triangle, with a substantial number of newborns. But in the Gaza Strip, it's basically all young people. Half of the population there is under 19 years old. So why are so many children born there? I think in such an economic environment, the marginal cost of having more children is not high. The difference between having 3 and 5 children is very small. Another key lesson is that Palestinians view having children as a form of resistance against Israel. So we see that the Gaza Strip hardly has any economy to speak of. The people living there are highly dependent on external supplies, both official and unofficial. Officially, the main support comes from the United Nations, with over $1 billion in material aid provided to Gaza annually. But the key is the unofficial channels. Considering the entire border of Gaza is heavily guarded by Israeli forces, one method Palestinians have thought of is digging tunnels. Since the blockade of Gaza began, Palestinians have continuously dug various new tunnels connecting to Israel and Egypt in the south. These tunnels are very sturdy, about 20 to 30 meters deep, and potentially up to 800 meters long. Through these, all sorts of things could be smuggled: fuel, cement, seeds, animals, food, medicine, clothing, etc., including weapons and personnel. While most of these tunnels rapidly deteriorated after a coup happened in Egypt in 2013, they remain Hamas's basic way of connecting with the outside world to avoid Israeli restrictions, and large amounts of military equipment smuggled by Hamas, mainly rockets, actually comes through these tunnels. The military conflicts between the two sides have been the most destructive to the Gaza Strip. Since 2007, not counting this year, the conflicts have caused over 6,400 Palestinian deaths and over 300 Israeli deaths. However, the conflict in October this year has already surpassed the total casualties of the past 16 years. Gaza is severely short of steel and cement needed to rebuild buildings destroyed by bombings. Most places have been turned into ruins and are left as they are. Gaza is known as the world's largest open-air prison. Half of the people living there are children who from the day they were born have lived in this isolated hell on earth. From their first day, they might naturally assume that it's normal to have power outages for half of the day, that they won't find a job after graduating from school, that they'll get sick once a month, and that missiles will fill the sky. The economy continues to rapidly deteriorate, and tomorrow is only likely to be worse than today. Alright, over these 2 videos we've talked about the economies of Israel and Palestine. Though only a wall separates the two, the living conditions of the residents are worlds apart. When dealing with such a controversial topic, it's inevitably a bit sensitive and emotions run high. But what I want to say is that the initial purpose of making these 2 videos was to help everyone understand as much as possible about the economies of Palestine and Israel. I chose angles that I personally believe have a significant impact on the economies of these 2 countries, rather than discussing it from military, war, or political perspectives. Of course, if you have any thoughts or additions, you're welcome to share them in the comments section.